substance use, substance abuse, and addiction. And I say one of the things because it's got to be put in the context of your whole life. And as we talk together, I think that you'll hear some of that as we come through. But you know, I've been in this business for a while from the public side and working with the community. And let me just share one example of that with you. Last summer, we had a zoning issue about a piece of property we were trying to buy. And it was kind of a public thing because people were upset about those people moving into their neighborhood. And as we talked about this, it got some attention in the media. And I was called and was on a radio show. And the disc jockey said, tell me why you think we should be able to have this place in the community. And I was talking about that, and I compared what I consider the disease of addiction, whether that's addiction to alcohol or another drug, to diabetes, and said it's a disease. And the disc jockey said, whoa, wait a minute. What do you think about that, people? He's saying it's a disease like diabetes. How can that be? It can't be a disease like diabetes. And this I knew before that, he said, you know, I'm in recovery, and I don't think it's a disease. I got choices. And what I do is under my choice. So how can it be a disease? I know they told me that in rehab, but I don't believe it. And I'm thinking about this and saying, you know, there's a piece that's really right about this. We have, for a very long time, said alcoholism and addiction is a disease. But I don't think we've done a good job of helping you or the community understand why we know this is a disease and what it means. And so some of that is because we haven't had a lot of good information. And I want to share some of the information we're beginning to find out as we look at this issue. And is it a disease or isn't it? When you think about yourself or someone else you know, you look at some behavioral pieces that happen. And you look at lying, cheating, stealing, irresponsibility, denial, selfishness, lack of caring, and say, boy, more often than not, that describes at least the way others see and perceive me. Isn't that true? And you gotta wonder, when you experience that about yourself, or when someone holds up a mirror and says, this is what you look like, you gotta wonder, what's causing that? I mean, is there something in my nature? Am I a sociopath? Is it because I'm a criminal and that's just the way I am? I'm self-centered, people tell me that. Character defects? Is there something about my personality? Maybe is it a lack of faith? Do I not have the right spirituality? Or maybe I'm possessed by a demon. Or maybe it's because of my experiences either with my parents or growing up in the neighborhood I grew up in. What's causing this? And that is what kind of goes to the heart of what I think is a really important argument here against addiction as a disease. And it goes something like this. Addiction is a behavior. Okay? And all behaviors are choices. This is what my friend the disc jockey was saying. I'm choosing to act in this way. Okay? And real diseases do not involve choice. And matter of fact, under some circumstances, the person who's addicted to alcohol or another drug can choose not to act that way. If, for example, one of you had a beer in front of you and you knew that you should not be drinking that beer, and I had a gun here and I said, you got a choice. You can pick up that beer and drink it and I'll shoot you, or you can decide not to drink that beer. What would most of you decide to do at that moment? Not drink that beer, right? Well, you made a choice. And if you make a choice once, that means it's all under your choice. That's the way this argument goes, right? People with other diseases like diabetes can't choose to have that disease. Right? That's the way the argument goes. Therefore, addiction isn't a disease. Now, what do you think about that? Anyone?
Say that again.
What do you think about that? That argument that if you choose to do it once, that means you can always choose, and therefore it can't be a disease, because diseases do not involve choice.
Well, you know, to be honest with you, I've never spoke on it, but I've actually felt the same way. And so to the point where I need to look at the dictionary and look up what exactly dis-ease means, because people that I know are born with it or they grow into it, but when it's a choice, is it really a disease?
Is it really a disease? That's a powerful argument, isn't it? I mean, it resonates. Yes, sir.
You also have the choice, though, to treat the disease or not treat the disease.
You do. And we're going to get to that, and you're going to get to that in a few minutes, too. Yes, sir.
Just because you didn't drink that beer doesn't mean you're not an alcoholic, though.
It's true.
So you can be like a dry drunk.
You could be like a dry drunk.
You might not be drinking, but all your other behaviors are the same.
And those are great points, all of them. And we're going to get to some of that. And I think this whole issue about choice and what does that mean for your behaviors really makes a difference. Now, I'm going to give you some perspectives. Now, there's a couple of dangers here. There's quite a bit of information here, okay? And it's a complex information, and I'm trying to simplify it, even for me. Okay? It's not for you, it's for me to understand it, okay? Because we're getting into something that has to do with a very complex situation. And for me to try to understand it clearly, I had to lay it out in some ways that I could understand it. So that's what I'm going to, but I run some risks with that because I could oversimplify it. But what I'm really looking at here is if we can answer this question, we're getting to two of life's major issues, okay? Kind of philosophical questions. What causes bad behavior, first of all, and what about free will and choice? And as a Christian, which I am, that question really becomes important too when you look at free will and how we understand it. But it's more than just philosophical questions, and you know this as well or better than I. We're talking about, this is really important because of what society makes decisions based on their answers to these questions and the stigma that goes with persons who are addicted to alcohol or other drugs. Because what do we do when you're addicted to alcohol or other drugs? Do we put you in the hospital and say you've got a health care issue? Not very often. Okay? In fact, we don't even intervene very early as a society in it. We let it go until what happens often? What happens to your life if your life is out of control and unmanageable and you keep going along and no one's intervening?
Jails, institutions, or
Jails,
death.
institutions, and death. That's exactly right. That's a stigma issue. You know? It's not true we don't do residential treatment in the state of Michigan. We just call them prisons. Okay? It's not really treatment, but that's where people end up. And that stigma issue means if you've got health insurance, it's very unlikely that it's going to pay for much of being at the Jelma house. Okay? And stigma issues mean that you're much more likely to see a cop than you are to see a doctor. And it's driven all the way through. Stigma issues means I got a disc jockey who's in recovery saying, what are you talking about? It's a disease. Okay? Stigma issue means we never got that property. This was for a women's program because the neighborhood said, we don't want those people in our neighborhood. That's what stigma means. I mean, we're talking about life and death and not just philosophy, are we not? Okay. Here's my simplistic approach. Kind of a simple disease model. It goes like this. An organ has a defect that's caused by something and it produces symptoms. Sounds simple enough. Like if I'm prancing around up here and I trip and break my leg, that's the cause. The leg is the organ. Break is the fracture is the defect. And I'm going to scream because I really don't like pain at all. And I'm going to probably bleed all over, and so I'm going to have to clean up the floor. And it'll probably be a deformity because the bone will probably stick out of the skin. And I got a disability because I won't be able to walk. Okay? So, right, simple medical model here. And so what happens is once you get me to the hospital or someone applies first aid, we'll see if Cindy is really trained in the first aid she's supposed to be trained in. And you'll get me to the hospital, and the doctor will ask a little bit about the cause, and you go, what an idiot. prancing around in front of everyone, okay? That was the cause, but I'm really not very concerned about that. And I see the symptoms. I see the bones sticking out. I hear you screaming. Yeah, you got a low pain threshold. That's too bad. You're bleeding all over. We'll deal with that. But really what I want to do is fix the fracture. Okay? The symptoms help diagnose. Cause helps diagnose. But what you do is fix the organ that has a defect. Right? In some cases, you can't fix it completely. Something like diabetes, I could do one on diabetes here, and basically you say you do something to help alleviate the defect. Okay? That's what they do. Let me ask you, what happens if you don't know the defective organ? What if you can't figure out what's wrong? What organ has a defect in it?
Troubleshoot.
Yeah. Look what happened about 100 years ago. The medical profession said, for people who are addicted to alcohol, we can't figure it out. Is it the organ has something to do with the mouth? They actually went through this, and they said, because you take it in orally, and they checked some things out and said, that doesn't seem right. And they said, when we check into people who died from this, and we look, and there's this thing called the liver, it looks different, maybe it's in the liver, but couldn't figure out what the connection was. Okay? They couldn't figure out what it was. And so what they said was, can't figure the organ that has a defect, must not be a disease. And what happens is you get effects like you quit doing medical research on this disease. You quit exploring it. Okay? You do things like you treat addicts as something different than patients. You call them alcoholics and addicts. They're not patients. They're not clients. They're not someone you have a professional relationship with. Okay? You leave, quote, treatment to a different system. Criminal justice system. Or, and this, understand me, this is not a knock on what came in its place, but the medical profession said, patient, heal thyself. And AA had to say, okay, no one else will do it, we'll do it. Okay. What other disease have we done that with? And it's all because we said it wasn't a disease that it happened. Social stigma, we already talked about. And we say, good thinking, caring people say, if it's not a disease, which of course it's not, then there must be some other reason for this, some other cause. Okay? And we started to look at other causal models. Now again, I think it's important. There's grains of truth in each one of these models, in every piece. So that's why they resonate with us and with other people. First of all, we say, God, there must be something wrong, like a sin or a weakness, the moral model. Well, those that are Christians look at some of the behaviors that we looked at first and said, yeah, there's lots of sins involved in that. Okay? So it resonates with people, right? Okay? But they make a conclusion that someone else have a weak will here. The difference between what you're experiencing and what someone else experiences is your will is weak. You yield to temptation. You sin more than other people. Okay? Or some people use the psychoanalytic model and say, really what we're talking about here is underlying this, there's a psychological reason. Maybe you've got a unconscious death threat or death wish for yourself. Okay? There's something underneath all of this. Or we say, like Dr. John Jellema, who the Jellema House was named after, who was a pioneer in this whole field, but what he believed in the 50s was there's an addictive personality. Okay? And that's what he wrote about. Okay? Or we say, and a lot of social workers, which I was originally trained as, also believe this too, that, what we're talking about as a cause is that there was something in their environment, their parents or the gang, that influenced them in this way, and they became that way. Now you look at that, and it makes, all pieces make some sense. Do they not? They resonate with you. If they didn't make some sense, people wouldn't believe them. They're trying to explain what they're seeing. But notice, in all of these, underlying all these models, there's a badness to it. And as soon as you adopt one of these models, you have to go to the conclusion that it's bad. Now, I'm not talking about bad and, things aren't good. I'm talking about there's a badness here, a morality badness piece. And that's a far cry from when we talk about a disease, right? I'm telling you, addiction is a disease. Conclusively, there is now overwhelming scientific evidence of something that we believed for a long time. And the organ that the disease is in is the brain. It's a hard thing to understand and to explain because the brain's really a complex thing. I mean, like, pick a more complex organ. You can't. Okay? I mean, we got computers now that send things to Mars and do all this investigation and, all this. This thing has got them beat. It's just one little section. Okay? This is much more complex. This thing, in fact, gets modified as it experiences its environments in an ongoing way. I mean, it is the most complex thing that has ever been created. And I'm going to try to explain it to you in the next half hour, right? And the other thing is there's no simple tests for this brain disease. I mean, you just can't go in and take a thermometer and stick it on your tongue and say, oh yeah, you've got addiction. There it is, right there. There's some really expensive tests that are starting to show that these brain scans are doing, and they're really making breakthroughs in a number of areas because of brain scans that they're doing. But it's not simple. And you know what? All people with any brain disease have a stigma because it's hard to see this organ. So I'm talking about kids that maybe have attention deficit disorder. I'm talking about people with sleep disorders. I'm talking about people with mental health issues, illnesses, which are all brain diseases. I'm even talking about people that may have something like multiple sclerosis, MS, and you're not seeing the physical effects. Okay? Anything we can't see, we have a hard time buying. Okay? And that's what's going on here. Well, let me try to explain to you about what we're seeing. First of all, put it in this context. I'm not talking about just the use of alcohol or other drugs. Okay? Understand, you guys understand, most adults in our society not only can legally use, but can handle the use of alcohol. They do not automatically become addicted to it. Right? Okay. So I'm not talking about just use. I'm not talking about just misuse, which I define as irresponsible or illegal use. So I'm not talking just an 18-year-old who drinks. That's misuse because it's illegal for an 18-year-old to drink. Okay? I'm just talking about that. In my field, there are two areas we talk about. One is abuse, and it's repeated continual use of the substance despite negative consequences. But when I'm talking about addiction as a disease, I'm talking about this, dependency or addiction. That's the uncontrolled, repeated use despite negative consequences. See the difference between the abuse and the dependency definition? What do you see as the difference? What's the difference in those last two? These last two here. What is the difference?
Uncontrolled.
Uncontrolled. That's the difference. Okay? So we're talking about the uncontrolled, repeated use despite negative consequences. Okay? That's what we're talking about with addiction. There are people who abuse a lot who I'm not necessarily talking about today. They keep doing it, I may be talking about them tomorrow. Okay? But today, not necessarily so. You may have heard some about this. Like, instead of working directly with people in a lot of this stuff, because it's probably not ethical to do this with people right away, they use things like mice and rats, okay? And years ago, there was a study done. You have these little rats running around, and you get a random behavior, and you reinforce it, and they repeat it, and that's how you train rats to do something, okay? Well, they taught rats to self-administrate cocaine by pressing on a lever. You guys hear about some of this before? Okay. And you know, these rats, they were good learners. And once exposed to cocaine, they learned this well. And they kept doing it to the point of ignoring everything else. Ignoring food, ignoring water, ignoring that female rat that was sitting in the cage with them. They just ignored it all once they began to use the cocaine, get this, to the point of death. Now, what self-respecting rat would do that? Anyone know?
Control.
An addicted rat. That's the rat that does that. Ignores everything else to the point of death. And I said, whoa, it's pretty interesting. So they did another series of studies and said, you know, we put this cocaine and it goes directly into their bloodstream, so we don't know what part of their body it's hitting, but we think it's hitting the brain, but we don't know what part of the brain. So he said, let's do some other studies. And we think that where it's going to go is the frontal cortex of the brain, okay, the front part up here. That is the part of the brain that kind of is the executive, is the captain of the ship, is the one that takes in information from other parts of the brains and makes decisions about it. And it gives some meaning to what it sees. It's where language comes from. It's a part of a brain that does emotional meaning. It's a part of the brain that's really is the self and the personality. Okay? It's where love, morality, decency, responsibility, and spirituality is contained in the frontal cortex. Now, rats don't have a big frontal cortex, okay? But it's bigger than, you know, than a snake's, for example, which doesn't have any frontal cortex. You know, a snake, all a snake knows is eat, sex, fight. That's it. That's a good day for a snake. Okay? Okay? But for a rat, it's got somewhat of a frontal cortex. Not that it's got a whole spiritual existence and all that, but it's saying, you know, it makes some decisions about things. It can learn some things, okay? That's in the frontal cortex. So when you look at this with people, you say, you know, it must be in the frontal cortex that addiction is occurring. Does that make sense? I mean, these are the things, you go back to our bad behaviors, that involves, right? So they said, oh, it's got to be there. So well, it's also the conscious part. Sorry, it's the conscious part. It's not the unconscious. It's the one where you are aware of what's going on. And so they put these little silver things right into the brain and put cocaine directly into those. So they didn't have to go through the bloodstream. And they started with the frontal cortex. And guess what happened when they did it in the frontal cortex? Nothing. Nothing happened. So, must have been a bad place we put it in. Let's try another place, and nothing. Said, well, let's move someplace else in the brain. And they went all over the brain. It didn't work. Guess what? Drugs don't work in the frontal cortex. They work in this area called the midbrain section of the brain. And it was almost by accident they found this. That is what's called the reward centers, or sometimes the pleasure centers are contained in the midbrain area. Okay? Now, for a social worker like me, or a Christian like me, the midbrain is a pretty scary, spooky, yet fascinating place. Okay? What does the midbrain do? What does it handle? Love, morality, decency, responsibility, spirituality, free will, conscious thought? Nope. It's the survival brain. It handles survival. Flight, fight, sex, food, those kinds of things is what handles there. The midbrain, as a survival brain, is not conscious. It handles what's going to happen in the next 30 seconds. It is the life or death processing sensory station. It takes in sensory data and makes a decision, in a sense, is this life or death? If it's not, it goes on. If it is, do something. Okay? Now, in our society, it's a little bit hard to get in touch with that. Okay? Back in caveman days, Me hungry, me go kill, me eat. Okay? That's pretty much midbrain stuff. Okay? Right there. Okay? But now think I'm hungry, may actually not even be hungry, and I wander to the refrigerator and look in there and say, nothing I really want. It's full, but it's nothing I really want. Well, maybe I'll go to the store and I could walk. Now I'll take the car. Those are all decisions. It's not really survival, right? And I'm driving down the street and say, oh, do I want to go to Meijer or do I want to go to D&W? Okay, I'll go D&W. And turn right here and make all that. And all that is just, I'm making decisions about it. It's not the survival level, right? Then I enter an intersection, and on my right, I see an SUV bearing down, and I just catch a glimpse of it, and I react. I just react. That's the midbrain. Because all of a sudden, I took in some sensory data that said, my life is in danger. And hopefully, I was trained well enough to slam on the brakes to do something, and I didn't go through this, okay, man, when I first learned to drive, you had to pump brakes on ice. No, is this, I hold the brake down, the computer takes care of it. I don't have to worry about that. I don't even think about that. I just react. That's the midbrain. Now, remember, mice self-administrated cocaine only to the reward centers of the midbrain. Okay, those big Latin words there, the particular centers where it happened. To the exclusion of all other survival behaviors, like food, water, and sex, to the point of death. How can that be? In this very survival brain that keeps me alive, somehow the drug trumped it. Somehow the drug hijacked the midbrain survival system. And all survival imperatives, the musts, are now taken care of by this drug. So the drug is more important than survival. It becomes survival at the unconscious level. Not as a choice, but at unconscious level. It's not just beer anymore. It is life. Does that make sense? What else do the mice experiments show us? Well, mice get addicted to drugs. And by the way, they've shown this with other drugs besides cocaine. Every drug they've shown this. They repeat it with experiments with mice. It's not just cocaine. But mice don't weigh moral choices or consequences. They don't go to church. They aren't sociopaths. They don't have bad parents. And there are no mice gangs. Okay? How can this be? The mice experiments help us separate correlation from causation. Okay? Addiction does exist where behavioral variables do not apply. Moral, personality, and social learning variables may be associated with addiction, but they cannot cause addiction. There's a difference between it goes along with it and what causes it. And that's what we've had so confused in this society. So, the thoughtful people among you will say, well, okay, you debunked all those other theories just now. So what causes it? Two factors that we know right now. One is genetics, and the second is stress. Just briefly on both of them. Genetics. Genes are inherited chemical recipes for proteins. Okay? And they tell the cells how much of each protein is needed and under what circumstance. That's basically what it does. It lays out this recipe. It's kind of like getting a recipe to cook by. And says, here's your ingredients. Okay? Now, neurotransmitters, which are proteins, what they do is they allow the neurons to communicate with each other. Okay, and they control thoughts and moods and behaviors and basically everything that we do. Okay? And here's some of the key neurotransmitters: dopamine, serotonin, GABA, and endorphins. And you can see they have different reasons they exist. Okay? Some are for reward stimulation, some mood sleep, some sedatives, some are natural painkillers. They're in the body already. They're telling the body, you know, need some more of this to control pain, need some more of this to relax, need some more of this to stimulate. Okay? It's the recipes the body's following. Well, a sense of well-being comes from the right combination of these neurotransmitters together. Which, remember, we're talking about genetics here. This is what you're born with. And a sense of unease will come from the wrong combination, or not having the right. So if a genetic recipe is deficient in one of these neurotransmitters, then you're going to have a reward deficiency syndrome. It's like having the recipe card and you're missing an ingredient. The food won't taste like it was supposed to. And it's really as simple and as complex as that. Okay? There's also a whole thing, genes have a thing called enzymes in them. And we're just beginning to learn something about this. I just use one example. They've identified, for example, an enzyme called GYP2B6. I don't know, someday we'll figure out more about it and it'll be named after someone, you know. Okay. But now what we know about this enzyme is it breaks down nicotine in the brain, lessening craving for nicotine. Well, we also know some people have more of this enzyme than others. So some people are just naturally born craving nicotine more than others because they don't have the right balance of enzymes. And I can't tell you the enzyme today because we don't know it yet, but I'm absolutely convinced we're going to find that to be true with other drugs as well as nicotine. That's kind of the quick genetics thing. So you're born possibly with the wrong balance in the recipe card. But there's another thing called stress. And I'm not talking about a little stress I feel standing up in front of you guys talking about this stuff. I'm not talking about, boy, stress because I got to talk in group. I'm talking about what, if not all of you, many of you have experienced, and it could be the stress of, as a kid, having unbearable physical demands placed on you by someone, abuse, neglect. Okay? I'm talking about the kind of stress that can happen as an adult, being in a relationship that is emotionally or physically abusive. I'm talking about the kind of stress of being brought up poor in a society that says you need to be rich to make it, continually. I'm talking about the kind of stress that happens because society says, I'm going to discriminate you because your color's wrong. I'm talking about the kind of stress that occurs because you're a national movie star or a professional athlete and you're expected to do things exactly right, perfect, all the time, constantly, literally under cameras. Talk about the kind of stress that goes with having your name being Rush Limbaugh or Betty Ford. Okay? That's stress. It's continual, it's constant, it's hard. Okay? That's the kind of stress we're talking about. Well, stress releases these chemicals that's what naturally happens under stress. If you have that going all the time, it's releasing a lot of them. And it comes in the midbrain and it starts to break down the dopamine system. And that becomes a direct threat to survival because this is the midbrain, right? And then what it does is actually changes the physiology of the midbrain. And so as stress hormones are released, it's two ways that it happens. One is stress hormones induce you to take higher risks. Why? Because you got to take risks in order to survive under stress. That's what your body's telling you naturally. Okay? You got a threat, take a risk that you normally wouldn't do. Well, think about that in our society. More likely to take risks, you're more likely to break the law. And the other thing it does is break down this dopamine system, which is a really key. Now, dopamine mediates what's called the experience of pleasure. And I'm not talking about pleasure, oh, things are nice or pleasant, okay? You know, some of my examples would be kind of like that. I'm talking about the way God created our body. Pleasure is our survival mechanism. You get pleasure out of certain activities so that you will repeat them so that the species will survive. Okay? Food tastes good, so I'll do it again. Sex feels good, so I'll do it again. Well, why do you do sex again? So we'll have kids and we'll keep the human race going. Why eat food? So I'll live. Okay? It's the natural part that God created in us so that we repeat things. Okay? Okay, and that's our way of assuring survival. And the stress hormones, what they do is reset, and I'll explain this in a minute, the set point of pleasure in the brain. And therefore, you can no longer derive normal pleasure from things that have been pleasurable in the past. You can't go along life always experiencing a high level of pleasure. Then it doesn't feel like pleasure. Okay? If it's the same all the time, it's not pleasure. What defines it as pleasure is you have peak experiences. You have highs. Okay? So you go around life and you go along and you visit Disneyland. And, oh, that's great. That feels good. Want to do that again too, but that was pleasurable. And then you go along and you have a job promotion. That was great. That was wonderful. You go along and your kid does well in school. Or you do well in school. You say, that's great. Repeat it. Well, what happens here is that set point is raised so that what normally would have got you above that set point, you can't do it anymore. It doesn't get you there. Okay? So what does the midbrain recognize? It recognizes a release of a lot of dopamine real quick. Okay? So you've got this kind of thing, or you go up fast and hard. Okay? It's not just getting above that threshold, but it's getting up there real fast. And it takes a lot of dopamine to do that. Well, it's interesting, the way we've been created too, is if you could just introduce dopamine in the system, it would really mess things up. I don't know if you know this, but you can buy dopamine in the drugstore. And if dopamine by itself, if you could just take dopamine, I'll tell you the street value of dopamine would be sky high. Right? I mean, we wouldn't have to mess with anything else. You just got right to dopamine. Okay? But have you ever heard anyone shooting up dopamine or using it? Why not? Because in the brain, there is what's called a blood-brain barrier that does not allow dopamine into the midbrain from coming from the outside. Okay? And why is that? Because if it got in there, it really messed things up. So we were created in a way, so what couldn't get in there? Not there. Can't get it in from the outside. What do? You need like a Trojan horse. You know, Trojan horses were people snuck inside this city, inside this big wooden Trojan horse. They thought it was a big horse, but it was really an army. Okay? That's what you need. So what's the Trojan horse? There's some chemicals that trick the body into releasing dopamine. Look at these. Alcohol and sedatives, opiates, cocaine, amphetamines, MDMA, hallucinogens, cannabinoids, inhalants, nicotine, caffeine, steroids. How about that? It's the drugs that we get addicted to. Those are the drugs that release dopamine, that fool the body into doing that. And, you know, it really doesn't matter what one we're talking about. They're showing from these brain scans, they may attack in different areas, but they all end up in the same reward pathway. Here's what they're showing is that cocaine, heroin, and nicotine, for example, all attack here and come down here. Alcohol hits there and comes there. Heroin, there, comes there. Okay? But they all end up using the same pathway. It's like getting on a highway. It didn't matter what exit you got on, you're all on the same highway. Okay? So it doesn't matter which drug you're talking about. Now, it probably matters as we get a little bit more complicated about that, is that we're finding out because of that neurotransmitter thing, that genetic recipe, that some people are more susceptible to certain drugs than others because that's what they're more deficient in, is an experience that that drug will give them. Okay, so in that way it matters. So people have drugs of choice, which I think, by the way, is not a word I really like because we're not talking about choice. Okay? But is there anything else besides another Trojan horse, besides the chemicals? Any guesses? You think we've got any other Trojan horses? Yeah? What do you think?
Behaviors.
Yeah, there's other behaviors. And what are they? Food, sex, relationships, gambling, performance, collection, rage, media, physical exertion. These, in fact, some to various degrees than others, okay, but release dopamine in the system. They have the same kind of experience for many people as what those chemicals do. And so, in fact, what happens is it explains what happens with addiction, whether you're talking about behaviors or chemicals. There's an artificial release of dopamine that occurs at levels never seen in nature. Okay? The body responds by adapting and making dopamine less effective. It's called tolerance to the dopamine. And then you're left with an insufficient amount of dopamine to communicate within the body. Because you need dopamine to do that. That's how it does it. Okay? For the neurotransmitters to function. And when that deficiency comes, experience we call craving. You guys know what craving is? Oh yeah. Because you know what? Craving is in fact the real key here. Because now you got a brain that through genetics or stress does not feel normal. And the person is not in a state of well-being. It's out of balance. Okay? And so to survive, you try to get back into balance. The signal to return to that balance is the craving. It is the body's alarm system. It says something is out of whack. And then the body craves a substance that it thinks will help survive. So craving becomes the motivation not for just using the drug, but for survival. The body thinks when you feel the craving, you gotta have what you're craving for to live. Not to die. It's not a death wish. It's a live wish. Is what the body is telling you. It's the real key to understanding addiction. And then we equate stress, because this happens, like that. Stress happens, it gets equated with craving, and we equate that right down to the real motivation. I don't have to tell you. Craving is real suffering. We're not talking about a psychological state. We're talking about something that is real. Like nothing else you've experienced. I think craving explains why it isn't simply a matter of choice. I think it explains why sober, which is what we started with here, someone said it's not just really sober to the goal, not just alcohol, explains why it's much more than just not drinking or not using. It has to do, you got to deal with the craving piece. In fact, if it's alcohol that you're craving for, taking alcohol out of the system makes it worse initially. Right? I mean, if you take the alcohol, the craving goes away. The body thinks things are fine. Okay? So getting sober by itself isn't the goal. I think it explains relapse. Unmanaged stress equals craving equals relapse. And the equation is that straightforward. Don't manage the stress, you will have craving, and it almost always brings you to relapse. And I think it explains, gentlemen, what I believe to be the incredible courage and willpower that it takes to stay in recovery. people addicted to alcohol and other drugs who are in recovery don't have weak wills. They have some of the strongest wills I have ever witnessed. You know what I mean? To stay in recovery and say to the captain of the ship, your brain, you're wrong, takes incredible willpower and courage. Because you're telling everything in you that's not right. Because everything is going towards survival. It is when I enter that intersection, the SUV comes barreling down on me, my reaction is to slam on the brakes. It's somehow telling me, no, don't slam on the brakes. Everything about me wants to slam on the brakes, right? To not use and to be in recovery is an incredible act of willpower. Remember that frontal cortex? Well, what happens to it? Stress is temporarily taken out of play because we're talking about in the midst of a survival panic. Okay? You can't draw upon those executive skills, values, rational thought, and that's in the frontal cortex. Okay? And in fact, this is a little side note, but we also know the frontal cortex actually can be damaged by early use of alcohol and other drugs. For males up to the age of 21, particularly 20, females, sorry, 20, and males 24. So someone asked me, based on the science, what the drinking age should be, I'd say females 20 and males 24. Okay, sorry guys, but that's what it is. So what we're knowing is this thing that's the executive, the captain of the ship, can get damaged by early use of alcohol and other drugs. Okay? But it's not that the person addicted doesn't have values. It's that the panic survival crisis, you can't draw upon those values. And the midbrain now reigns. And the conscious thought becomes constricted. Okay? But the frontal cortex doesn't stay out at all. Remember, the midbrain rules for 30 seconds. Frontal cortex comes back in. But it's after the midbrain has misperceived what is going on. And it says, midbrain said wrongly that to survive I got to use this drug. Okay? And that's the message it sends on to the frontal cortex. Okay? And there we assign personal meaning to it. So it's not just a drug and I'm going to survive. It is the drug I have a relationship with. The drug that I love. The drug that now means more to me than anything else in the world. Frontal cortex is doing that. It's assigning personal meaning. That emotional relationship that gets developed, and you derive your whole sense of self from the drug. So, in your own mind, you're no longer a person using or addicted to alcohol. You're an alcoholic. It defines your whole sense of being. So addiction, reward deficiency syndrome. Just a little summary, because of lack of internal neurotransmitters leading to a sense of incompleteness or decreased pain tolerance or uneasiness or anxiety. That's all what may result of is genetic neurotransmitters. Genetically or environmentally programmed to have a deficiency, you're at increased risk for finding an answer in a substance or a behavior. Definition of addiction now becomes a dysfunction of the reward or pleasure system, resulting in decreased functioning, specifically loss of control, craving, and persistent drug use despite negative consequences. I'll come back to that one in a second. Let me ask you, does it fit the disease model? Midbrain's the organ. The cause is genetics or stress. Loss of control, craving, and persistent use despite negative consequences are all the symptoms, and the defect is a reward deficiency. Does it fit? Yeah, it does. Now, I told you it was kind of a simplistic model, but that's the model we have. And when we talk about addiction being a disease, my contention is it's not because it's not a disease that we're having problems with calling addiction a disease. It's because there's problems with the model itself, the medical model. And just real quickly, the medical model is really overly simplistic. I was telling you that, okay? But a real problem in the medical model, it creates a dependency, a sick role. You know, it de-emphasizes responsibility and overemphasizes authority. Doc, patient. Doc does the work, patient lays there. Okay? That's a problem in the medical model. That's not a problem in addiction. Okay? That's a problem in the medical model. It doesn't consider the whole person in his environment. I mean, it's got this little simplistic, where's the organ I can fix? Okay? You can't figure out what to do with spirituality. Prayer, spirituality, God, higher power. I'm not quite sure what to do that in the doc-patient relationship. And the medical model doesn't know what to do. And basically it's also kind of economically and politically broken, the whole medical model system. So the problems that we sometimes get accused of that say, therefore you can't be a disease model, I'm saying, no, those are problems in the disease model. We are a disease, but there's problems in the disease model. That doesn't excuse us from handling the criticism that we need to about those pieces. And one of them is about responsibility. I don't know what you hear, but the thing I hear most is, if I call it a disease, that somehow takes people off the hook. If anyone leaves here today and says, Bill Paxton said it's a disease, therefore I'm not responsible, then you need to come talk to me personally, because that's not what I'm telling you. What I'm telling you is determining cause and accepting responsibility are not the same thing. All we did was figure out cause, genetics or stress, okay, and organ, brain. But I didn't say you weren't responsible for something, okay? Having a disease makes you more responsible. I have high cholesterol. A lot of years I didn't know that, but I took a test, found out I had cholesterol. Doc says you need to do something about it. You need to be responsible. What do I need to do? You need to exercise. Okay. You need to not eat certain foods and eat others. Okay. Did that for a while, and then came and said you need to take this little pill called Lipitor, because you're not getting it down the way you should be, even though you're doing all this stuff. Okay. Knowing all of that makes me more responsible. I got to exercise, I got to eat right, and I got to take a Lipitor every day. I'm more responsible because I know I got the disease, not less. Okay? And good treatment programs teach people they're responsible, and I hope we're doing that here. Take responsibility for your actions. Why do we have you involved in meal preparation? Why do we have you involved in cleanup? Why do we have you involved in doing community service? Why do we involved in taking care of your room? It's not because you're cheap labor, if someone told you that, it's because that's how you teach responsibility. Okay? The other criticism I hear when we talk about the disease model is what about spirituality? Well, I think it fits perfectly in here. That key is this frontal cortex assigning personal meaning. You gotta find something that has more personal meaning for you than the drug. And my friends, I'm here to tell you, there's nothing in life that has more personal meaning than a personal relationship with God. If you don't want to buy that, it's up to you. Then find something that has more personal meaning than the drug. But I personally cannot find anything in life that has more personal meaning than my individual relationship with my God. And you have to find, it's a matter of life or death, something that has more personal meaning than the drug. If it's your wife, go for it. If it's your child, go for it. But God is there too. And that, for most people, and this is what AA taught us, can be in the higher power. It also fits in, I think, because spirituality is demonstrated through relationship. It's not just a vertical. It's this. And what happens in groups, and what happens when you're in groups, what happens in your community, what happens in your neighborhood, is spirituality. And that's what you got to look at and work on, is those relationship pieces, because spirituality happens through them. And spirituality also fits in because of the power of prayer. Historically, science hasn't had a clue what to do with prayer. But every one of you know examples of miracles happening, and someone said it's because of prayer. Now, interestingly, they're actually showing pretty scientific studies now that brain chemistry changes during prayer. I mean, they're pretty controlled studies where someone is, all they're doing is praying, and the brain looks different during and after prayer, okay? So this may come around the tie in there too, but I kind of like to leave it as in the spiritual realm, because God works in mysterious ways, and that's one of the ways it works. I think that one of the things that's important to talk about from all of this, I know it's a lot of information, but I'm kind of a practical guy. I'm kind of like, so what difference does this make? And to be really honest with you, we are just beginning to understand the implications of the stuff I just presented to you. Just beginning to understand it with treatment. Just beginning to understand it with social policy and language. And I want to just give you some flavors of what we're beginning to understand. We already know that what we're doing in treatment, it works. We have, in addictions treatment, as good a rates of recovery as any chronic disease that has lifestyle choices, like diabetes or asthma or chronic heart disease. Nationally, in addictions treatment, 40 to 45% of people stay in recovery. That's better than the other chronic diseases by 5 to 10%, depending on what studies you look at. Now, you may have been told your chances of staying in recovery are only, what, 5, 10, 15? I hear different stats. What did you hear?
1 out of every 10.
1 out of 10. Not with treatment. That is not true. On your own, it's 1 out of 10. With AA only, it's about 1 out of 4. With AA in treatment, it's 45%. That's a lot better odds than what you've been told. Is that not right? And I know you can do it, because I know people who are choosing to get into recovery have incredible courage and strong will. Okay. Also, if it means anything to you or not, providing addictions treatment can save society lots of money. For a dollar spent on treatment, depending on the study, it's between $5 and $8, and that's conservative. There's actually some studies that came out as high as $11, but it's like, whoa! I mean, that can't be right, because if that was true, everyone would invest in treatment, right? Well, probably not, even if it was true. But it has to do with what the costs are to society, with unemployment, with welfare, with crime, with prison systems, okay? And it's not talking about a dollar spent on someone, Joe, Frank, okay, if he stays in treatment, that will save money. No, it's every dollar spent. We'll cut that off. You just spend $1. We're not even talking about how many people stay in treatment. Okay? It's that effective. I mean, I can't think of a better investment right now for your money right now than treatment. I mean, it's better than anything else I got invested in any place. Okay? But the reason we're not doing it widely as a society is that whole stigma thing, because no one understands what we just went through. You guys now understand. But you know, I believe if we take the things that we just talked about, which I said are kind of new to the field, and apply it, we can do better than 40 or 45%. And I mean we, because it's a partnership. Okay? In fact, here's the hypothesis. Punishment, which we talked about, is one of the natural consequences of people buying other models, right? Punishment is a variable contributing directly to low outcomes, if we consider 45%. Okay? So, to test the hypothesis, we need one group of people that is treated without punishment. We need just one group that if they retained in their jobs and roles, rather than strip them of that. So we can keep them in treatment and not take all this stuff away, not have all the negative stuff that goes with it. If we could only find one group. I mean, do you know of any group like that? Anyone who's not stripped of their job or stripped of their dignity or stripped of the being a husband and father and your status in society? Do you know anyone like that? Had a look away, is what we found them. And guess who they are? They're pilots. Pilots. I mean, those people that fly those big things that you're up in the sky. The U.S. Navy enjoys a 95 to 97% return to flying status rate when its pilots treated for alcoholism. 95 to 97%. Now that's return to job rate. You say, well, that's not recovery. Yes, it is. They're not going to have them flying those machines unless they're in recovery. Right. United Airlines, 87% return. Now, the U.S. Navy and United is not going to tell you this stuff. I mean, imagine getting on a plane and you hear this voice saying, "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, I'm your captain. Hi, I'm Joe, and I'm a recovering alcoholic." Ain't gonna happen. I mean, you know, they're gonna get off the plane, takes care of long lines of security, no one wants to fly anymore. Okay? You don't want to hear about it. But it's happening. Now, how do they do this? What's so special about pilots? Well, first of all, they love to fly. I mean, it's not just a job for them, it's they can't think of anything they'd rather do than fly. Okay? It's an irrational emotional meaning. They're also really good at coping with stress. I mean, putting those big pieces of metal up in the air with all the things that are going on, and the confusion and going down those runways, there's a lot of stress. Okay? And those that are in the Navy, it's military stress along with it. Right? They're really good at it. And you know what? They're not punished. If you are discovered to have alcoholism in the Navy or United Airlines, you are not punished. You're treated as if it's a disease and they get you help now. And they're treated as capable. They return them to work fast. You know what? 30 days after going into treatment, U.S. Navy pilots are flying again. 30 days. The United Airlines takes a little longer, it's 90 days. Okay, but the Navy thinks that's why their rate's only 87% and the Navy's rate is 97%. Because they're taking too long. You gotta treat people as capable. Okay? They're not allowed to be in that sick role. Okay? You get out and you do it. And you know, they're really good at having fun. Okay? It's one of their coping mechanisms. So what happens is you get coping mechanisms that they're by stress, and this whole thing changes. And the cortex comes back online because there's not a threat to survival anymore. Okay? The issue is not giving up pleasure, which is sometimes is what you're heard, because that's how you got associated with all the alcohol and other drug use. There's all this pleasure. You know better, but that's the way society associated all this pleasure stuff. The issue is you don't have to give up pleasure. The issue is you got to get away from fast, rapid dopamine, and you got to get to the system where pleasure over time is used to cope. And when you do that, that whole set point comes back down. So really what we got to talk about is pleasure rehab, okay? It's self-denial, whether we're talking about a program like Jama House or your individual program, if it's built on self-denial, it's not going to work. Okay? You got to practice pleasure. Things that will return that dopamine system back. Okay? Broad recreational activities, then this, what I call sometimes pleasure deafness, you can start hearing again, it'll get resolved. The reward system comes back online. AA is saying we absolutely insist on having fun because our lives depend on it. So what kind of implications for recovery? Again, whether we're talking about a program like the Jama House, but I want you to think about your individual program. Because all we can do is try to give you some tools, admittedly imperfectly. This is what you got to do with them. You got to learn how to manage stress. Number one. Find tools to prevent your relapse by learning how to handle stress. And you got to find some tools for decreasing cravings. There's a couple of things, and I'll be the first to admit that we here have got some things to learn on this, but this whole thing about addressing neurotransmitters, there's two things that in other fields they have shown help to this. Even if we at Pathfinder and Jama House are not doing this perfectly, I challenge you to think about it, okay? First of all is exercise. Regular, consistent exercise brings the neurotransmitter system back into balance. And they've shown that again and again and again. You don't have to have a lot of equipment. You don't have to do it very hard. It has to be regular. Okay? And the other one, and we are going to be looking more at this, has to do with food and what you eat. Okay? White flour and sugar keep the system out of whack. Initial stages. Okay? And I know there's a lot of starchy stuff here, and we need to look at that. But you do too. Okay? I personally have been trying to do this more, and so you go in a restaurant, it can be hard, but I don't eat all the bread that they want to serve me. Okay? And what I'm finding out, it's better for me if I don't eat all of it, and that's what I'm telling you. And what we know is it will help decrease your cravings because the neurotransmitters will get back into line more quickly. And then you got to find ways of normal pleasure because you remember this whole system's out of whack. It thinks not only do you have to have Disneyland, but it thinks more than that. It thinks you got to have the drugs or the other recreational activities that you're using in excess. You got to find more normal ways to have that pleasure. You got to get this thing back re-engaged quickly. Okay? Because this is where that willpower that I know you have is contained. This is where your thought process is. So you got to find what has that thing, what is that thing that has more emotional meaning for you than the drug? And you got to practice experiencing that as frequently and as healthily as possible. If that is spirituality for you, then you gotta just not do that individually, you gotta do that with people, you gotta do that consistently. If that's in church, great. If that's another experience, that's fine. But you've got to have that experience. Okay? It's like the pilot getting back to flying. That's the motivation. I want to fly. Okay? Well, what do you want to do more than anything else? Or what do you want to have a relationship with more than anything else? That's what we got to get in touch with. And we can also re-educate this thing. I've been using this example of me entering the intersection and slamming on my brakes. Well, I wasn't born learning to do that. I was taught to do that. In fact, I was taught twice, because like I said, I first learned you got to pump the brakes on ice, and then I learned, no, you just hold them down because the computer will take care of it in the car. And it took me a while to learn that, okay? But I did, I relearned it. So you can relearn. You can re-educate the frontal cortex. And that's why we've got curriculum-based groups sometimes. There's certain things that you need to learn. And the coping skills. What do you need to learn to cope? It kind of brings us full cycle to managing stress. Before I move on to this one, does that make some sense?
Yeah.
Okay? And I hope we're giving you opportunities to learn those pieces. Can't make you learn, obviously. But that's the stuff you need to do. Okay? I'm just going to have you think just real briefly with me about some language stuff here. It's not substance abuse that's the disease. And the whole field's at fault for saying this. It's substance dependency or addiction. Could call it substance use disorders. That's the larger category. Remember those 4 things I talked about: use, misuse, abuse, and addiction. Okay? We can call those substance use disorders: misuse, abuse, and addiction. Okay? But when we talk about the whole thing as being abuse, I mean, somehow it becomes your willful act of doing something that is in this negative consequence kind of category. You know what I mean? It's, what else do we talk about with abuse? What other abuses do you know? Child abuse. Is that a good thing? Spouse abuse. Is that a good thing? Abusing your friendship with someone. Is that a good thing? No. So if what we end up talking about is what you have is substance abuse, that can't be a good thing. Okay? And it's more than, you're right, that's not a good thing, but it's more than that. I mean, there's this implication that you're bad. And no, you have a disorder that because of genetics or stress, your body naturally wants to use chemicals or behaviors to act in ways to feel normal. They're not going to work. If no one's told you that yet, I'll tell you that. That won't work, you know. But that's what you're trying to do. I mean, it sounds like a system trying to survive to me, and that's not a bad thing. That whole thing about the pleasure, the reward system, and the pathways, and how the substances may initially be at different parts, but they all end up with the dopamine system, becomes really important here. Because to the brain, there isn't any difference between alcohol, cocaine, heroin, or nicotine. To the brain, it all is the same thing, and it changes the dopamine system, which doesn't allow you to experience the reward and pleasures like someone who doesn't have the reward deficiency syndrome. The brain, it doesn't matter. It solves for me a riddle. I mean, alcohol is a very different drug than cocaine, than heroin, than nicotine, is it not? So how can it be similar? Because the brain puts it all on the same highway. That's how it is. Now they're getting a little sophisticated with this, and the different drugs have different effects on the dopamine system, but basically it breaks it, it changes it. And they're just finding out. I mean, there was just an article in this month's Neuropsychology journal that talked about they're beginning to get some handles on what part of it. But the bottom line's the same. The dopamine system gets broken. Okay? So that's why that's important. My friends, you're not alcoholics or addicts. You're people. And you have substance dependency disorders. You're people. You're people who have functioning brains that exercise free will on the boundaries of your reality, which includes they've got a disease. And your choices, we were talking about choices at the beginning, are about how you manage your disease. That's what people do. The rats don't do that. Any questions?
Yeah. The midbrain, is that also called the hypothalamus, that which controls the autonomic nervous system?
Yeah, it's part of it. It's a part of it. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
You say many of us were addicts or addicted to something before we even picked up, right?
Could be.
Could be.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, before I picked up a drink or a joint, I'm trying to figure out what was I addicted to, or is it coming from my father or mother's chromosomes or DNA that made me addicted, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, maybe. You have, what we can say conclusively is you have, if your father, mother, grandparents, or close relative were addicted to a substance, that the chances are pretty great that genetically you will become addicted to that substance if you use it. So it's kind of like, it's in your system. Now, if you never use alcohol or another drug, you won't become addicted to it. Which is, by the way, one of the things you should be teaching your kids. They need to know this stuff too, because genetically, the chances are greater that they will also have problems with alcohol or other drugs, simply because you do. Because genetically, you may be passing that on. So we have a group, and we don't know enough how much is genetic and how much is due to this stress. But we know both are the causes and are involved. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect sense.
Okay.
Even if we know they weren't using, let's just say they didn't use then or whatever, and their grandparents or my grandfather's grandfather who was an Indian smoked peyote or did something, it's getting way down to me. When I took that first one, my DNA remembered,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah, kind
Yeah.
of. You know, genetics, guys, remember, I'm a social worker. I mean, you know, if you had told my high school biology and chemistry teacher, I'd be standing up here talking about the brain and neurochemistry, they'd say, right, and he's going to star in the NBA too, you know. You know, so I've got some limited understanding of this, but this is kind of how I remember out of genetics, is that you've got two genes that come together, okay, the chances of them having identical kind of recipes coming to that are nil. There'll be some combination of that. And if over time you kind of get it out of the gene pool, eventually it won't be there. So if you're marrying people who do not have that gene in there, eventually the chances are that it'll go down. Okay? I mean, that's the way it works with colors of eyes, colors of skin, hair, baldness. All that stuff is in genes. Okay? All that stuff is the recipes that we're born with. But that's, you know, two lines that are coming together, and over time something can get out of the gene pool. I mean, this is the way we are like animals. I don't know if, you know, dog shows, they try to do these perfect dogs. Part of that's training, but part of it is breeding, or horse races, right? I mean, you got to find the right stud and the right mare, and you get the right kind of horse sometimes. Okay? Okay, so but that's genetics, and they make selections. And we don't do that as people, and I'm glad we don't quite that way, but that's what happens. Yeah.
Could it also stand true as far as feelings, like feelings of inferiority or feelings of
That's
apathy
interesting.
or just people not caring way back from, so not that it's not chemical, but a feeling that my great-great-granddaddy had, and he passed on to his child, could that, you know, be...
You know, I think there's probably some truth to that, and we don't know all the answers to that, but it has to do with the neurochemicals, the neurotransmitters that we're getting in our genes, and that right kind of balance. So what's the balance between the dopamine and the serotonin and the GABA and the other natural chemicals in your body? I mean, we've got all these chemicals in our body, we're born with it. And so how are they put together in the right way? Okay, and if they're not put together in the right way, and that's what the genetic recipe says, and you keep, that could possibly pop up in subsequent generations. We certainly know that to be true for what we recognize more as mental illnesses, like a significant depression. Okay, we know that to be genetic. Now, is it all genetic? No, there's a stress thing that happens, and the stress releases these kinds of chemicals in the brain, and the brain reacts to it. Okay?
Thank
Make sense? Yeah.
First, I'd like to say your presentation was great. I don't think we can get it any better than that. I just came from a meeting and I was speaking with my sponsor, and I told him, well, he's not my sponsor, he's my mentor. He's going to be my sponsor. And I told him I had a smidgen of reservation, and it had to do with the pleasure aspects of my drug use, that kind of thing. And he told me the same thing, you know, it's not about giving up my pleasure, but the things I did to get that pleasure,
Yeah.
you know, the use of the drug,
Yeah.
you know, and that's very
Right,
informative,
right.
you know.
In basic,
Yeah.
what helps me remember, it's kind of like your brain told you the wrong thing about what would help with that pleasure. I mean, it wasn't trying to mislead you. It thought it was telling you the right thing, but it didn't tell you the right thing. So you gotta get re-educated about that. You gotta learn that something's different than what your brain does.
So that's the frontal cortex coming back
Got
into its natural line of things, right?
Okay, I think that's, yeah, is that right, Cindy?
Yeah, you have to be back at.
Yeah. Thank you very much, gentlemen. I appreciate the opportunity.
you.